Thank you, everybody. It's a beautiful venue we have here. It's just a spectacular place. It's good to be in the UK. I've managed to get out to the countryside in the UK a few times, but never got to spend time in London. And we just got back from doing a talk at the Steiner House in London, and that was really nice as well. So it's a beautiful country. So tonight we're going to talk about Therify and a little bit about quantify and the structured water that was on the list. So Therify is, for those of you how many people know about the Therify? Okay, very few, and some people are new. Okay, very good. All right. So Therify is a wellness device that utilizes plasma to create an electrostatic field around the device, and it's based on a Tesla coil, which is an air coil, the air transformer that was designed by Nikola Tesla. In my history of learning about these types of things over the years, I kind of went back in history to find, what have we missed in our technologies, especially in the world of electromedical instruments in electrotherapy. In modern times, we use electricity, and electromedical instruments are generally considered to be diagnostic instruments and not treatment instruments. And that's because through the years, in the early days, in the early 1900s, when electricity was just sort of a novel thing, and we were starting to wire up houses to have electric lights and that, a lot of people were looking at its use for the healing benefits of electricity. And if you look in the old medical books and that, you'll see chapters in there dedicated to healing with electricity. But at some point in time, those chapters sort of got weeded out of the books. In America, as the FDA came on board and the pharmaceutical companies gained power and the pharmaceutical model took over our medical system. And this isn't that long ago. For thousands of years, food was our medicine, herbs were our medicine, natural things from the environment. In Chinese medicine, they use everything for medicine except the kitchen sink, basically. So.
Oh no, they use that.
Yeah, well, that's probably in there too. Yeah. So I started looking at some of these characters throughout history, and one of the first people I ran across that was developing devices like this was Royal Raymond Rife, back in the 90s, I suppose.
1904 to 30.
Yeah, well, when I discovered Royal Rife would have been in the 90s, because nobody had heard about him back then. Even back then, there was a lot of really obscure information. I think around 87, 88, there was a book called The Cancer Cure That Worked that was written by Barry Loynes, and he talked about this fellow, Dr. Royal Raymond Rife. And there wasn't a lot of information about him back then, so I joined this group. We called ourselves the Rife Society, and we had annual meetings that grew into conferences and things like that. And slowly over the years, all this information started coming up about Royal Rife and what he was doing. And he thought he could, he built this universal microscope that he said he could see beyond the theoretical wavelength of light. So you're seeing down to very small things. So it enabled him to look at very small things, bacteria, and viruses that were impossible to do with a standard microscope. And today we can do that with electron scanning microscopes, but everything that was under the microscope has to die because it's get scanned with a beam of electrons. So he was able to look at living things, so powerful, this universal microscope. It had like 12,000 moving pieces in it, and he was just a master mechanical engineer, and he designed these. He was friends with Carl Zeiss in Germany, and Zeiss made all the lenses, and he archived things and recorded things with cameras. That you can see an old film camera at the top there, and film cameras and that. And all this stuff kind of got sort of slowly dug up over the years, and I started building Rife machines, and so Therify's inspiration kind of comes from that, and several other characters like Antoine, Prioré in France, and that. And I looked at a lot of these people in the early days. Even as a kid, my interests were in the more esoteric side of things. This is Walter Russell and his book, The Message of the Divine Iliad. He wrote another really great book called The Universal One that I highly recommend if anybody hasn't heard of Walter Russell to dig into that. Another one of my childhood heroes, I suppose, was Wilhelm Reich, and he's another person who got sidelined. He was a psychologist, and they ended up burning a lot of his books. Same with Royal Rife. He ended up, his story didn't end too well. He ended up in prison, and the American Medical Association, even though he cured 13 terminally ill patients of cancer, they basically sought out all his machines that were at medical practitioners' offices all over America, and they basically said, give up your machine or we'll take away your license. So these kind of things were heavily suppressed. Wilhelm Reich was heavily suppressed, and they burnt a lot of his books as well. Victor Schauberger, we're going to talk a little bit about water. He was the water wizard, and I studied his work at an early age too, and made a lot of different experiments with water, and had a bottled water company in the early days, back before you could buy bottled water at the store commonly. And people said to me, well, that's crazy. Who's going to buy water? No, nobody in their right mind is going to pay for water. Yeah, that's just not going to take off. And it was kind of ahead of its time, and unfortunately it didn't. We talked to a lot of people back then. Even Coca-Cola, they tried our water and they said, wow, this is phenomenal water, but we're planning to do our own bottled water line, and we're just going to take tap water and filter it and put it in bottled waters, and we think we'll do pretty good with that, and they did. The water we were making, of course, took a lot of processing and a lot of equipment. We were using crystals and lasers and electromagnetic fields and all kinds of things, and it was a lot of work to do that, but it made some pretty amazing water, and I've seen some pretty amazing things with water over the years, which, Victor Schauberger showed that he said, nature was my teacher. He was like a fifth generation forest warden, like his grandfather and grandfather before him. They were all forest wardens, so he spent a lot of time in nature observing how water moved and how water flowed. And he created these machines that utilize this amazing power of water. And, he could do things like create levitating devices. And he showed through a lot of his drawings on how water has to move in vortices. And that's what we're going to talk a bit about tonight, the structured water, and get into that. And water responds, quite strongly to things like magnetic fields, even though you can't really pick up water with a magnet. You can do things like turn on your tap very slow, and when your water is running and all the molecules are sort of realigning to that water stream, it's slightly paramagnetic, where you can hold a magnet next to that stream and you'll see that little stream of water move. Nikola Tesla was another one of my sort of childhood heroes, and again, very obscure character back then. Nowadays, everybody knows about Tesla, and because the Tesla cars and all these things, and a lot of information's come out. But when I was, in grade 6 and 7, I asked my teachers about Nikola Tesla, and do they know anything about him? Where can I find some books? Because there was a short little blurb about him in the encyclopedias, but not a lot. And they would say things like, oh yeah, I don't know about that guy. Yeah, he invented some motor or something like that. But you want to look at no, not Einstein, but Thomas Edison, because he invented the light bulb, and he was a great inventor. And so whenever I realized that there wasn't a lot to some of these characters in history, I started digging in and finding the real stories and how their stuff was suppressed in that. So that led me to build all kinds of different Tesla coils. I've built a lot of different coils over the years. The latest one that I call Junior is part of a pair. The Big Daddy is the next one up to it. This one shoots out 5 million volts. It'll shoot 20 feet in the air. And I'm just going to play a little video clip for you. You can see it in action. Because this coil is very special. It's, you know, it would have been really Tesla's dream. He wasn't able to, in those days, they didn't have transistors. So he relied on the resistance of the air and capacitance in bottles that he would fill with salt solutions to create a capacitor and create an RLC circuit with the coil. And nowadays we have high-speed switching transistors basically that can switch really fast. And you can switch them into the audio range. So a lot of the coils I build can be modulated with any particular frequency that I like. So this one here is capable of doing that and a large, with a large output. Whoa, this might be loud. So we're going to turn this down. Wow. Sorry, I didn't know it was going to be that loud. It's almost as loud as the real thing. When I fire that off, neighbors come from miles away and they're like, what the heck is going on here?
Paul, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Electricity.
Yeah.
So this is electricity. It's supposed to be healed, right?
You're right.
But a lot of the buildings now are getting electrified.
Right.
Is that good or bad?
It's good and bad.
Yeah.
So what Tesla talked about was there's different types of electricity. And the electricity that was healing electricity, he called like cold electricity. And that's what we're doing with the Therify. It's utilizing cold electricity. Well, this is pushing 5 million volts. That's probably about half cranked. So there's maybe about 2.5 million volts going there. The Therify runs at about 300,000 volts. So you're really getting about 300,000 volts from the top of your head to the tip of your toe. And what that's doing is creating microcurrents within the body. Like, we're standing way back there. That's why it looks like it's arcing all over. But you feel, your hair standing up. And if you got too close to this one, it would just blow your head off, basically. So, but fortunately, this would be hot electricity. So what you're seeing here, when it converts over into that, it's hot electricity. And there's also noise that is involved with electricity if you basically don't have a clean enough signal. And that's where we get a lot of the electrosmog and electropollution and harmful electromagnetic fields. But it can be used, for healing as well as destructive purposes. So, yeah.
One question. That tune that we heard, is that applied by you?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a MIDI file that I recorded, and I played it on the keyboard and then recorded it to MIDI, and I have a keyboard there. I can play it live as well.
So you put in the signal of the tune,
Yeah.
and you ramp it up to the right frequency.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So.
Just for dramatic effect.
Yeah. Yeah, I do a lot of the high voltage, high tension experiments, and we'll show some of those here. We'll talk about them in a bit. So I've always been into sound and analog synthesizers and keyboards and that. So I build my own analog systems, and this is a modular system. I'm working on a course right now that is going to be fun coming up. It's called The Geometry of Sound, and it's a 2-part workshop, and the other one is The Sound of Geometry. And so these days I'm taking three-dimensional shapes and turning them into sound. One of the processors isn't there, but it's in some of these other units. So basically, there's so many, sound is such a powerful thing for healing. Everybody knows when you listen to music, you get emotionally moved. Your body's sort of a chemical manufacturing warehouse, and we run on all these different chemicals. The pharmaceutical model's kind of taken that, and they have a Newtonian kind of idea that there is an active ingredient. And so when you're cooking or when you're working with herbs and that, they're always trying to isolate the active ingredient that has a pharmaceutical effect, but they throw away the other 1,000 chemicals, because in every plant there's thousands of chemicals. So if you can imagine when you cook a dish and you're doing a stir fry with mushrooms and asparagus and all these things, you're getting all those phytochemical nutrients from those things. Well, our body runs on those. And so when we listen to sound, we get triggered to release certain chemicals like adrenaline. If you hear a roar of a tiger and you're in the jungle, instantly your adrenaline is going to rush and you run away. And when a baby's nursing with its mother, it gets a release of oxytocin, and the mother does as well, to be on the complete opposite side of things. So our bodies run on these chemicals, and through sound and through light, we can affect biological systems to release these chemicals. So this is the Quantify, and it's basically a smaller little brother version of the Therify. It utilizes plasma as well, and a little teeny Tesla coil, which can be controlled. And this has a little amplifier that you can basically put any signals you want into it. So you can play like Tibetan monks chanting, or you can utilize Rife-type frequencies. Like, over the years, people have figured out which frequencies are relevant for which disorders. And we've made these empirical lists, and you can look up Rife frequency lists. In the original Rife machine, when he developed his first machine, he only basically had about 12 different frequencies that he worked with. And his amplifiers were, of course, back then a lot more crude, so it was really hard to modulate higher frequencies in that. But basically what he was doing was taking RF signals and modulating plasma and driving certain frequencies on a carrier wave to affect that. So when he isolated those viruses that he saw in his microscope, he would inject those that little bit of whatever he isolated out of the culture, and he would inject it into rats, and he would grow a tumor in the rat. So he proved that whatever it was he was isolating from things could cause cancer. And when he injected in the rats, they would grow a tumor, and he had an operating room next to his laboratory, and he'd take that tumor out, and he'd grow a tumor like big, like almost the same size as the rat. And then he would treat it with his machine, and the cancer wouldn't grow back, whereas the ones he didn't treat with his RF device, the cancer did. So the Quantify is able to the Therify has a set audio kind of signature in there that's all based on phi ratio and Planck's length. That is the algorithm that Dan Winter had come up with, and that's what drives the main core of the Therify. But with the Quantify, it's kind of open inputs on it, so you can put whatever you like in there. These are some of the earlier versions of tubes on the first Therify. I used to use these in the processing the water. So I had these tubes laying around, and we made a bunch of them sort of with this shape. And the idea was this, to create a spinning vortexes of plasma within the tubes. So all these arms on the tubes come in tangentially, and one spins clockwise and the other one spins counterclockwise. So it creates this washing machine effect of two opposite vortices. And it emulates nature, because everything in nature spins. Everything in nature has this duality nature to it. So it has a positive when one side's positive, the other side's negative, and it goes back and forth like this. And I call it the human battery charger is one of the terms for it, because when you're in the center of those two vortices, it basically charges up all the cells in your body. And as those microcurrents move through your body, they give all the cells a little massage, and it increases the cellular respiration, basically the uptake of different nutrients and elimination of waste, which is very important for your cells. And when we talk about, stagnant qi and things like that, when things get stuck in your body, sometimes we do that with herbs to get it moving, or acupuncture, or various different things. And this is sort of the electrical way of breaking those blockages. So the plasma is considered the fourth state of matter. We're really familiar with solids, liquids, and gases, and we're going to talk about water this evening. And water is one of the few things on Earth that actually, in this particular standard temperature and pressure, can be all three states. And so when things are solid, in water's case, all the molecules slow down. All molecules are always moving and bouncing around. Even in hard things like this table and that, it takes a lot to slow them down. If you really want to slow down molecular movement within materials, we freeze them with cryogenic freezers to get them really to slow down. They'll lock into position. But the colder things get, the slower those molecules move. And they'll form a solid where they align like crystals. And when you look at an ice cube, it's really just a liquid crystal. In the liquid state, and that's what we're going to look at today, there's a lot of changing and fluid motions happening in liquids. And then, of course, when you boil the water, it'll turn into a gaseous sort of vapor. But the Therify and the Quantify use this fourth state of matter, which is plasma. And what's happening is, once you've reached a gaseous state, the more rarefied it gets, you're pulling the molecules out. So one of the things that I should point out that a lot of people say about the Therify is it's cold atmospheric plasma. And it's partially right. It is a cold plasma, but it's not atmospheric. You'll hear about that in a lot of papers and things that people are using it to heal wounds and things like that. Basically, electricity and plasma is capable of, killing bacteria and viruses quite effectively. If you can imagine that Tesla coil that we just watched, basically every time that lightning strike came out, anything that would have been in the air, including down to the viral level, is just completely annihilated. So we use the plasma in the Therify to not only create these photonic emissions, because what's happening as the molecules move apart, and in the cases of the plasma in the Therify tubes, they're noble gases. So those are atomic elements that don't like to stick with anything else. That's why they call them noble. And so they're easier to excite. And when you excite them, the electrons jump off of the atom, and every time they do that, a photon is released. So that's what you're seeing, the photonic emission from the light that you're seeing there is coming from that plasma and that excited light. The Therify itself is also combining a magnetic field that's created by the large Tesla coil that's sitting beside the table, and it creates a big magnetic field in a toroidal field this way, and then you got each of the plasma tubes spinning, creating toroidal fields this way. So you're immersed in this field of electrostatic potential with a high magnetic field, and it's that combination that is does the magic with the Therify. So plasma is not really all that, even though a lot of people are starting to discover these things, and it's a big talk and how we use it in the future and things like that. And we will be able to do a lot with it, because basically all of creation, everything created here, was created from plasma. The universe is 99.999% plasma. When you look at the sun, that's just a big ball of plasma. All life is created, all the elements are created through that. I don't agree with the Big Bang theory where all of a sudden, poof, there was one day and everything existed. Elements can transmute and are being produced all the time, where they say you need a nuclear reaction like in the core of the sun to produce these elements. And I think as we go further down this path, we're going to understand that elements are just harmonic nodes. So the first element on the periodic table is hydrogen, and it has a single proton and a single electron that we'll look at in a bit here. And hydrogen plasmas are very effective. I've done several experiments with hydrogen plasmas, and they're really amazing. And so as elements grow and through a fusion process, everybody's heard about cold fusion and Pons and Fleischmann and what happened in America there, and then there was a big pushback against people tried to replicate their experiments and said, oh no, it's not real, it can't happen. But because it takes a lot of energy to make a fusion process, whereas fission is a little bit easier. We know from when we made the nuclear bomb and all our power grid is run by nuclear reactors. You have a few here in the UK and all over Europe, we run our power on it because it's a lot easier to make a fission reaction than it is a fusion reaction. This is the whole thing about cold fusion. They don't understand how can you do it with so little energy, because what you stand to gain is a lot of energy. So if we crack that, basically we'll have unlimited energy potential. And really, if the universe is made up of this plasma, well, what's running all this plasma? You know, people say, well, that just defies the second law of thermodynamics. You know, you can't get all this energy from nothing. But I say, you know, they say there's no such thing as free energy. And I say, well, actually, there's nothing but free energy. We live in an infinite sea of energy. All this is energy, and all this condensed energy into matter. And we know when we break that matter, it releases large amounts of energy. So yeah, it doesn't get created or destroyed, but it can be transferred between these realms. And the key is to do it efficiently and effectively. And most of the cold fusion reactions, the key to doing it is utilizing this type of plasma. So the logo of the Therify is based on these carvings in the pyramids in Dendera and the Hathor temples. And, you know, people have argued about these over the years. You know, they've said, oh, it's a light bulb. Obviously, this serpent is the symbol of energy, and they're powered by the Jed. The Jed is a power symbol. The Jed of Osiris powering up, connected to this serpent that winds to the lotus flower, and it's encapsulated in some kind of tube, and it's giving off light. And as Roger pointed out the other day, well, yeah, because when you go into the pyramids, you don't see torch marks on the ceiling from soot. If that's how they were in there carving these things in the pitch dark, there's no carbon markings in there. So where were they getting the light to light up these things? So just by fluke one day, I was playing with some older tubes that I had and kind of created one of these serpents in the tube, just kind of by accident. But you know, plasma is very responsive to magnetic fields, and when you're near when you're in the Therify itself, you become part of the circuit. So your body is directly coupled with the plasma, and it will move, and it has almost like a mind of its own. That's why Irving Langmuir called it plasma. He said because it has some kind of consciousness. It's alive. It's living in it, and it can and do things. So it responds to things, and that's part of their problem with the fusion reactions as well, is that they're trying to master this plasma to confine it and contain it and compress it into smaller. The more and more you could compress it and push it down into a smaller amount, the more closer you're going to get to having a fusion reaction. And the amount of energy that it takes to do that is just insane. So most of you've heard in the news lately, oh yeah, we just achieved it, but it took them like 30 gigawatts of power dumping in to get 30.00001 gigawatts out. And so they're not very efficient yet, but we'll see where that goes. But you see this kind of serpent it'll respond to your hand. You can touch it and you can move it and it'll move around and do things like that. And it also has a little rattlesnake tail. These are sort of harmonic nodes that are formed in the plasma itself, and they're just a series of compression and rarefaction. So that's a good example of where you're seeing the longitudinal wave that's being produced in here. So sound pressure moves through the air in these form of compression and rarefaction, and so that would be basically the frequency of what's running there, and it's moving in a longitudinal way, sort of like when you drop a rock into a pond and you see those ripples ripple outwards. That energy is moving in that way. And one of the things about, everybody's heard about Tesla's wireless electricity is that, he was able to create electricity that could light up light bulbs at a remote distance. And in his experiments at Colorado Springs, he did that for miles around his laboratory, planted light bulbs in the ground. So this is just a fluorescent light bulb laying on the bed of the Therify, and there's no wires connected to it at all. It just lights up in the electrostatic field. So a lot of people say, when I talk about that currents moving through your body and the micro massage, they say, oh yeah, there's no connection there, but this easily proves that. And I've got a little video that'll show the longitudinal waves in this tube, so you can see how it's moving. If that sound is going to come on, I wonder if I can mute that on here. Yeah, I think I should be able to turn this down to nothing, just so we don't get any great loud sounds. So even in the light, with the lights on, you can see this is lit up quite well there. Turn the lights back off so you can see. So here again, you see those little nodes of compression and rarefaction. And if I animate it, thanks. Now you can see it moving in this longitudinal field. So you just see the tubes at each end. And if you look real closely, there seems to be this point right in the center where it looks like it's emanating from. If you have the right shutter speed on your camera, you'll see it converging towards the center. It kind of comes in and bounces back. But that center point is the point of counter space. We think of electricity, the way we teach it in schools, is that it's electrons that are moving down the wires, and the electrons, everything's kind of contained within the wire. But we know that the electrons sort of move to the outer surface of the wire, but what nobody's really looking at is the fields around the wire, because electricity is more than just those electrons moving down the wires. It's contained in the field between the two conductors. If you have a positive and a negative wire, and it's leading to a light bulb and lighting up the light bulb and coming back, then you're creating this magnetic fields around there, and what you have is this dielectricity, which not too many people know about. The dielectric field is what the Therify is utilizing. And if you look really closely, you'll notice that most wires or light bulbs and most things that you have connected to the plug, well, it has two prongs on it, because the electricity's got to come into it and go back out. In the Therify, you'll see just one single wire going to the light bulb, but it still lights up. So how is it doing that? And the reason why it's doing that is because I split the cathode and the anode of what you would have a light bulb. You'd have these two things and a filament in between. So instead of that little wire filament that you have in the light bulb, your body becomes that wire filament. So the electricity is split into the single wire transmission that goes to the tubes, and you're basically are a capacitor in the circuit. So you're intimately connected in the circuit, and the Therify seems to compensate for that extra capacitance in there, and that's where the magic happens once you step into the field. And this one might show that a little bit better. Yeah, so I don't know if I can zoom in on this. No. But yeah, that gives you really good visualization of how these longitudinal waves are being utilized in the Therify. And basically, this is the main body of the amplifier, and there's a computer in there that's running the frequencies, and it connects to a large Tesla coil that's underneath or beside the bed, and that's basically how it works. And yeah, yeah, and I always say, well, the proof's in the pudding, and when you know animals respond to these types of things, you know there's something really going on, because anybody who has cats or dogs always says, my dog will come, he'll lay right in the center in the sweet spot in the counter space between the tubes, and they're quite content to be there. Even cats that are a little more finicky, they're real curious, and they'll jump up and sit in the field. And we've had people do all kinds of different treatments with various animals with it. And the whole device is basically based on phi ratio. Physically, not only just the phi ratio signatures in the algorithm within the device, but the actual design of it. And somebody had asked me earlier today, they said, can you explain the difference between phi ratio and Fibonacci sequence, and explain the phi ratio kind of simply. So I'm going to give it a little attempt here. But basically, it is exactly that. It's a ratio. If this is a unit of 1, A plus B is to A as A is to B. So 0.618 of that 1 is the A, so the majority of it. And that's why it's called the golden mean. It's a ratio that occurs in patterns that we see in nature all the time. So when that ratio gets repeated, it tends to bend in on the angle of the shorter side, and the pattern repeats, so you get these spirals. And that's what we call the golden mean spiral. And the Fibonacci sequence itself is basically just a sequence of numbers that you can start with 1 plus 1 equals 2, and then you take the 2 and add it to the previous number, which is becomes 3, which becomes 5, which becomes 8, 13, 21, and so on. So if you look at these first, the difference between the Fibonacci sequence and the real golden mean is that the way to understand it is that the Fibonacci sequence approximates the golden mean, and as it gets higher and higher in value, it comes closer and closer to the golden mean. So you see when we start off, 1 and 1 makes 2, well that's only 50%. So then if we went back to here, this 1 to 2, you'd be cutting that line right here. So the Fibonacci sequence starts here. And as it moves forward, those lines come closer and closer and closer to approximating this 0.618 or 1.618. So that's...
Obviously it's an irrational number, whereas the Fibonacci
yeah.
is real numbers.
Yeah, the phi number is infinite. So we haven't figured out if it's ad repetend. That number just keeps going on and on. It's an infinite number, irrational number. Whereas this sort of rational way to get to it. And so we've never found the final decimal place. Maybe when we get supercomputers someday we'll run it. I don't know what it's been calculated to, but it's been calculated to hundreds of thousands of decimal places. And that's what these irrational numbers are, is they really are infinite. And so one of the best ways to the representation of that is the pentagram, because there you see the unit of 1, and then the unit of A and B. So A and B, that's your 6.18, and it's the divine cut. And some really interesting numbers come out of this. We won't go into the math too much, but what's important here is to pay attention to this 108 degrees, the 72 degrees on these angles, and the 36. And then, of course, connecting all the points and within the center, and this is a fractal and recursive pattern that repeats infinitely inwards and infinitely outwards, just like the universe. So just like we look at spiraling, when you pull the drain on your plug and you see water moves in this spiraling nature and goes down the drain, it's on a microcosmic scale, and we zoom way out into the cosmos and we see in a macrocosmic scale, our galaxy is a spiral galaxy that spins in the same thing. So these patterns are infinitely repeating, and on a large scale to a small scale. And that's why for the Greeks, it was common knowledge about the Platonic solids, at least 4 of them, and the 5th one they kept secret. And phi and 5 are a relationship because it's 5-sided, and they basically, it was a skill testing question. If you were able to put all these pieces of the puzzle together, then you were into the club and you could join the academy with Plato and Socrates and those guys. But they kept this information secret from the common people. And the dodecahedron, which represents sort of the ether. You have a tetrahedron, represents fire. The cube represents earth. The octahedron is air, and the icosahedron is water. So those were the common elements that everybody knew: earth, air, water, and fire. But the 5th element was the element that connected everything together, and that was the spirit. So this was the symbolism of the ether and the divinity and how all things were connected together. And then when you do that...
I just want to make a point.
Sure.
Today,
yeah.
we did the cycle of 60 that the Taoists used. The whole thing about the dodeca, it's actually 60-sided. So and we say that's the shape of the universe. And by the way, science agrees that that is the shape of the universe. And the Taoists figured that out as well with their 60-sided sequence of the binomials. Yeah, well, this is the 12 sides in the dodecahedron, but when you take, it's called a dual, where you get the 60 when you combine the icosa and the which all this is going to be relevant. The icosa dodeca is the 60. That's the buckyball, and yeah, that's where all the secrets lie in how to transfer from one of these solids to the other, because everything, again, is fractal and recursive, and all the Platonic solids can fit into each other. And essentially, this is what's happening with water. Water is the key to life. Nothing can live without water, and this is the reason why, because water is the information carrier that can take that information in these clusters that form these Platonic solid shapes, and that's where the information is contained. And it contains the keys to everything that is running in the whole universe as well as in your body. All your nutrients, even down to the DNA level. Your DNA is surrounded by these tetrahedrons, and you look down from the top down of the DNA, you'll see the dodecahedron. And it ratchets on down like these dodecahedrons that are continuously ratcheting. And protein structures rely on water to hold them in place. And folding and unfolding proteins are a real key to how biology works. And some of the secrets of nature that we'll talk about on the biohacking thing, we'll get into proteins and amino acids and peptides and that. But the geometries in these things are just fascinating. And water is the key that holds us all together. So that's why you're made up of, 90% water. So when we look at this perfect representation of phi and how this is incorporated into the therify, so those early tubes were just sort of the prototype tubes, because that's what was laying on the shelf. But
I changed the design to incorporate phi ratio into the tubes and to really get a good vortex in this cone shape spinning. So now the arms are coming in tangentially, and inside of this is called inductive coupling, the way these couplings connect on here, electrodes, and it excites the plasma inside of there, and it spins around and around and around. So then plasma comes out of each one of these arms, and it's spinning as it comes out, and then they twist and they braid. So there's braids on a braid on a braid, and the plasma moves in this direction in this multi-vortex pattern. And it's all phi ratio. So that's part of the magic. So this 108 degrees becomes really important when we talk about clustered water. The water molecule has a standard midpoint. This is called the bond angles, this 104.5 degrees, and basically you have an oxygen and two hydrogens, and the bond angle is, they'd give this 104.5 as just a set number because those bond angles are flexible and they can go up and down like this, like a hinge. And they can move plus or minus 15 degrees. So that gives us a lot of variation of angles of geometry. So we can go all the way down to 90 degrees, which is really hard. So if you think about it, you could move water molecules into 90 degrees and make a square. Anytime you make the cube or the square, they can join up. And that's where you see really dead water that is just totally unusable. Water can be, we talk about water as, there's two things we have to look at. It's like quantitative and qualitative. And we look at quantitative and we say, well, if it's really pure water, there's no other elements in there, it's just H2O, so it's really pure water. So it can be really pure water like distilled water, but it's not that good. It's not good for you when you drink distilled water. It'll pull minerals out of your bones. How is that happening? Well, that's because distilled water, those angles compress and it gets closer to those 90-degree angles. And then they're really hungry because they need minerals to get back. So there's a lot of things people do. The other one is alkaline water. And I'm probably going to burst a few people's bubbles here. But alkaline water is not what you're getting any kind of healing benefits from or anything like that. When the water alkalinity gets too high, you also change that structure of water. But so that's quantitative, where we're looking at impurities in the water. You have the qualitative, the quality. So the quality is not so good because the water isn't able to make the proper geometries to do those things, like to build around the DNA and to attach to different molecules as you breathing in, even air and everything like that. It's all transported through your body, and all the nutrients that you eat in your food gets mixed with water, and it's water that surrounds them that allows it, enables the nutrients to be to let into your body. And one of the big problems we have, like Naam talked about this morning, was in Western civilization, we all have these gut issues, and the gut issues are what was primarily happening in the gut is the tight junctions in your intestines. They're like, your intestines have a geometric web too. You've seen the little cilia in there. They're like these little fingers. And those fingers, as your food moves through and it gets broken down by the stomach acid primarily. Another important thing is what happens in your body is the first thing you eat food, you hit an alkaline environment that's in your mouth. Your saliva is alkaline. And then it goes down to your stomach. Your stomach is acidic. So you just did a pH swing with it. So, if you just wolf down your food and you don't chew it and goes in your stomach, all of a sudden it doesn't work because those things can't break down. A lot of the different nutrients need to be broken down by the alkalinity of your saliva first. And you always, drink your food and chew your water kind of saying. So the more alkaline saliva you secrete, and even if you just, pick up a banana, the second you pick it up, sensors go off in your head that start secreting the saliva, and you're actually secreting a balanced saliva that's made to break down the chemicals that are in that banana, because your body just intuitively knows. So you go through this first alkaline wash, then you swallow the banana and it goes into an acid wash. And we do this in chemistry, we call it a pH swing. When you want to break things apart and you have a complex fluid full of all kinds of different molecules, you can take up the alkalinity, take up the pH, and things will condense together, and then you take it into acidic and it'll break it apart. So that's how your body's naturally breaking it apart. So it hits the acid environment of your stomach, more things are breaking apart there. Then it goes into the small intestines, which becomes alkaline again. So you're doing this pH swing, and you break it apart, put it together, break it apart, put it together. Then in your large intestine, again, it goes back to acidic. And so in your large intestine, then you have these cilia, and there's these things we call tight junctions. And the tight junctions have to open up to allow the nutrient molecules to come into your system. And the problem with the Western diet today is because people eat milkshakes and hamburgers and pops and sodas and basically anything that comes in a box. Basically everything in your grocery store that's on the center aisles. You know, if you just go to your grocery store and you shop around the outside and you hit your meats, your dairy and your vegetables and fruits and seeds, nuts and berries, those are the things you want to eat. Anything that's packaged in a box and is processed, well, that's what destroys those tight junctions, and those chemicals and everything we add to the food disrupt how those tight junctions go. And when those tight junctions open up and let bigger molecules in that your body can't process, what do you have? They call leaky gut syndrome. That's what leaky gut syndrome is. So now you're letting in all these big compounds that were never meant to be into your bloodstream and into your body at all. And the water is also damaged by environmental things. Drinking from plastic water bottles is just a whole nother story. The biphenyls, hormone mimickers that you're getting from the chemicals in the plastic is another big no-no. So in a modern industrialized society, we've really done a lot of damage to our food and our food systems, and almost to the extent where you could say it's pretty well been weaponized because it makes money, and a lot of unfortunate things will happen to your body. So, by the way, that when they say BPA free in your plastic bottles, the chemical that they replaced it with, that's a biphenyl B, they just replaced it with another phenol that's even worse. So they're hormone mimickers. What that does in the plastic is it softens up the plastic. It gives those molecules a little more flexibility. So when you squeeze your water bottle, it actually squeezes. It doesn't just break. It keeps some elasticity in there. So over the years, especially in the last 50, 60 years, we've created, I don't know what the number must be now, into the millions of different chemical compounds that never existed on this planet before. And our environment is just filled with them. And because water is the universal solvent, and it just carries these chemicals along with it because that's what it wants to do. Water wants to naturally bond with, as it does with the phytochemicals, with all these other chemicals. And then we created things like glyphosate and chemicals that don't break down in the environment. Yeah, they'll kill plants, but once the plants are dead, it takes 4 or 5 years for that glyphosate, and it just ends up in the water stream and floats downstream and ends up back in your drinking water if you're not getting it from your food and your grains and all the things you're eating. Same with pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceutical chemicals don't break down that easily. They pass through your system. They go out in your urine, they go into the toilet, they go back into the system. That's another one of my pet peeves, is we are really insulting water by using it in toilets. It's just the stupidest thing. You know, in nature, what do animals do? They don't, you know, run down to the stream and take a leak or a dump into the stream every time they gotta go. They just go naturally, and it composts and it becomes, you know, a fertile environment in the soil where the bacteria can integrate naturally, and then you get magical things growing out of it, like mushrooms or or things. But life basically feeds on life, and if you disrupt that chemical chain, especially water, who is the ultimate the carrier of this life force energy and all the memories of everything and information, it's just an insult to do that. So ultimately what we should be doing is having compost toilets. We have the technology now. You can buy a compost toilet for a couple $1,000, a little more expensive. But the thing is, it's not convenient. So the problem with people is that it's like, give me convenience or give me death, to quote the dead Kennedys. It's easy to just flush it down. But when you think about the processing and everything that we have to do to clean up that water as it goes, and what's happening with the pharmaceutical pills everybody's taken, the heart medication, the birth control pills, all those things are hard to break down. They end up in the water stream, they get downstream. Even our water processing plants aren't capable of filtering out those very, very fine molecules. And they end up going around back in the system, and they end up in your taps and coming back around. And they go around and around until they eventually are broken down. But so our bodies are, made up of water. You've heard the 90% water, the 75% water, all those things. Basically, when we're born, newborn babies, and again, this is the qualitative versus quantitative thing. So it's not about that number of how much water is in your body, because they say, well, by the time you age, you're only down to 70% water, but newborn babies are like 90% water, and they're pristine in that. But the water that's in those babies is more qualitative. It has the proper bond angles. It's perfect. When you see babies in their perfection, every water molecule in their bodies is aligned perfectly, because that's the job. That's why the baby floats as an embryo inside the embryonic sac, because all that water is structured perfectly and maintained to keep that life. So all the different things that water does in our body, we know all these things. And I've taught alchemy classes over, since the last 25 years, 30 years or so. And the ancients, basically, we talked about this earlier, had these 4 elements, and they were more like archetypes. They didn't literally think that there was just earth, air, water, and fire. They used it as sort of an archetype or a way of conceiving of what things were made up of. So if you have a piece of steel, let's say, or a rock or something, it's really hard, so it has more earth. But it also has some water in there, and some fire, and some air. There's fire in there because the metal, when it sits in the sunshine, you can feel the warmth from it. There's water in it because you can bend some metals. So some metals that bend, they would say, would have a little more of the water element in it. And metals that are harder to bend have less water. Even a table, which is made, out of wood, it's a little bit softer, so it's got more water. But it also floats on water, so therefore it's got more air in it, whereas the metal would sink to the bottom of the water. So they looked at everything in the environment of being made up of these 4 basic elements. And of course, the secret 5th element, the dodecahedron, is this spirit that ties it all together. And I would call it the ether. The ether is sort of the matrix that we in the last 100 years or so, it was commonly said, it was just the ether is how all these platonic solids can nest together, and they manifest through this matrix. And science has kind of had a bunch of experiments back in the early 1900s, and they said, we disproved the ether theory, the ether does not exist, because they couldn't see it. So a lot of things we do with science and instruments and that, unless we can see it, feel it, measure it, it just doesn't exist. And these are one of the things that we haven't been able to really understand yet, but someday we'll get there. And so as I was saying, everything as these energies of the ether creates a matrix, if you will, that's continuously fluid, dynamic, and harmonic nodes form on these nodes of these matrix. And the very first thing that can come into existence from light as it starts to slow down and solidify in a harmonic node is the first element on the periodic table, which is hydrogen. So the hydrogen here is represented underneath the water. The first element there is water. You can remember these because fire is hot and it points up, water stays down, and earth has layers in the crust, so the next element there, earth, and air has layers in the atmosphere, is fire. And I've never seen anybody really talk about this much, but there's some really key numbers to how these elements form together. Like if you go back and look at Walter Russell in his book called The Universal One, he laid out the periodic table in these spirals. And carbon was like a hinge at the center of the periodic table. And you remember he wrote this before there really was the periodic table as we know it today, and before a lot of elements were even discovered. And so he showed that on these spirals, there's harmonic nodes where the elements fit in, and he actually predicted elements that we found later on, and even isotopes. So isotopes can happen in atoms where they have different amounts of protons in their nucleus, and they can vary slightly, and hydrogen can vary into 3 basic isotopes. This first one here, we have 1 proton and 1 electron, but they can also have 2 more neutrons, and then you have tritium. Tritium's 3, and what's the second one? Basically, heavy water is made up of that element. So when the water gets heavy, when it's made from a nuclear reaction, it has more weight to the nucleus, slightly more. So these interesting numbers come about that you have 1 electron and 1 proton in the hydrogen, and carbon has 6 electrons in the outer shells, 6 neutrons, and 6 protons. Then nitrogen, 7 electrons, 7 protons, 7 neutrons, and oxygen, 888. So maybe this is where we get the sacred 888 number, lucky number from China. They understood that oxygen was important for life. And the reason why people say, oh, why isn't oxygen, why don't you relate it to air? But it's related to fire. I relate it to fire because without oxygen, nothing will burn it. Fire needs oxygen to burn. And basically these 3 states of matter can go in this little cycle from liquid to gas through evaporation. And this is basically the fundamental principles. This is why the alchemists talked about all this time. These kind of things is because this is how they saw nature and the workings of nature. And these cycles go over. So you have the ocean is basically just a big body of liquid. It evaporates and goes up into the clouds. The clouds form and then it rains and it condenses down and comes down to the ground into the solid. Then the solids can melt into liquids. So if you take something like an ice cube, you have a solid ice, it'll melt into liquid, and you heat it up, it'll evaporate into gas. And these cycles go around and around and around. And they can also go the other way around. If you have gases and it gets very cold, like in the wintertime when you're in the car and you breathe on the window, and your water from vapor from your breath attaches to the window, it condenses into a liquid, and if it gets even colder, it'll freeze into a solid. And there's a special thing that can happen from solids. If they get really heated quickly, they can go skip the liquid process, and we call it sublimation. So we use that in alchemy in a lot of senses where we take metals and different salts and things like that. We sublimate them, and they just turn straight from solid to gas. And if we can capture them in that form, we get some amazing crystals that we can do a lot of things with. And here's the most amazing crystal that we know of is water. So this is, if you were to look at water, sort of an electron scanning microscope level, if you could see down to it, that thing. The one thing is you wouldn't be able to freeze it like this to see it in action, but here's what's happening is you have these charges, because it's all about charge. When you get to the fundamental principles of physics, chemistry, biology, when you really get down to the nitty-gritty of anything, it's all about charge. And crystals, as you know, the quartz crystal in your watch keeps time. When you put charge on it, it pulses at a regular rate, so we've used them for keeping time. Piezoelectric clickers, like in your barbecue, when you push that button, it's hitting a crystal with a mechanical force, and it's releasing electricity. And that electricity gives off the charge, and you see the little charge come out on these hydrogen bonds here. These are the covalent bonds that attach the hydrogen to the oxygens, and they're really, really hard to break. They're strong bonds from the strong nuclear force. And then we have charge on the molecule itself. So interestingly enough, it's a balanced molecule that is it has no residual charge, but it becomes polar. This is why water, we call it a polar solvent, because it comes polarized. It has a positive side and a negative side. And that allows it to work like these building blocks. So if you combine, we talked about earlier, the bond angles and the polarity of the water molecule, you can build all kinds of interesting things, and that's what water does. These are the types of orbitals. It's a map of the orbitals of how the electrons move around the water molecule, and this is be a little more accurate to what it really looks like on an energetic level. The idea of the atomist concept of these electrons spinning around you can't look at it as an atomic thing. The model of the electron, it's a little dot that spins around this thing, is kind of not quite true. What you see, you get this probability theory, and when you look at things, you're more likely to see the electron. That's why we call these orbitals in these sort of orbital shapes. So anytime any two molecules connect together, they have this probability of where the electrons are going to be. So the oxygen and the hydrogen share these electrons, and because of the polar nature, it has this odd-shaped charge field around it. And because this water molecule is like a hinge and it can move up and down, it can create all kinds of different geometries. And there's all kinds of deep chemistry. You can get into this. There's the charge in that field can get very strong or very weak depending on the bond angles that we have here. And you can see them moving back and forth. And so what happens when these guys all get together is they make like little Lego blocks of these magnets that kind of stick to each other. And so the covalent bonds that are holding the hydrogens, those kind of hold on, and then the hydrogen bonds where the hydrogen can stick to the next oxygen atom, because here it's strongly attracted to this guy. He's not going to let go, but he's strongly attracted here too. So they end up forming these shapes and geometries. So when we talk about structured water, what we're talking about is how these molecules align up, as well as when we talk about quality of water. So when water moves in nature, it's continuously moving in vortices as it goes down the stream. It's spilling over the rocks, and it's going to the stream, and these molecules are continuously getting tumbled in that. And as they do, anytime water moves in a spinning vortex, it likes to align in these charged clusters. And that's why when you drink from a pristine spring in that, it's the charge clusters that create these structured water superstructures that basically give that energetic properties to the water. If you distill water and you put it through your distiller, or you expose water to UV light, so remember how the photons are jumping off the atoms inside of the every time the electrons jumping the shells inside the plasma, how the photons are being emitted. It works the other way around. Water can absorb light, and when you treat water with UV light, what happens? You're killing all the bacteria and all the bad things. That's why we do it. That high energy, high intensity, down in that low spectrum of light, just basically rips things apart. And it'll do it. That's why you get skin cancer if you get exposed to too much sun. Supposedly, if you're the damage is coming from the UV radiation, because that UV can actually rip apart. You know, if you leave a plastic bag out in your backyard and it's sitting in your backyard and you leave it in the sun for a long time, it falls apart and starts to degrade. That's the UV breaking the bonds and that. So when you get exposed to the UV with your skin, it can destroy the DNA. So it's breaking the DNA. And when bacteria that are very small cells and have genetic structures that aren't that strong, they're more exposed, UV light will destroy those, and microorganisms and things like that are very weak cells, and the genetics are very susceptible to UV, so it breaks them down. So the light will also change. So now we've got movement that can change the cluster structure in water, and light, and then the geometries start to come about. So here's a C60 with a 60-sided icosadodeca, or a fullerene or buckyball. And these act as clathrite cages, and these cages can contain molecules. So here is a single molecule of water, which they've been able to do, implanted inside a fullerene. But the water itself interacts with all these things to form these geometries. So as we talked about in the DNA, this is how the water forms around the DNA to form these tetrahedral fields. And when you stack all these tetrahedrons together, they become a spiral. So the water holds all those protein chains together to form a spiral. And it just keeps going. So as we build these structures, and what really puts them together, so we got influence, water is influenced by all these things. So it's influenced by light, magnetic fields, the environment, and minerals, and every other thing that's dissolved in the water. So when you get salt and you have sodium chloride and you put it in the water and it dissolves in the water, where does it go? It splits off into these two ions, sodium and fluoride, and so, or sodium fluoride or sodium chloride. Fluoride will do the same thing. All those things become ions. Then each one of those ions gets stuck in the middle of one of these clusters, and they start to form different shapes. So the best way to structure your water is to put in healthy minerals from sea salt and things like that. Then you'll get these charged clusters of water around those ions, and they just can keep building and building and building. And they can form tight little networks like this, or sorry, loose ones like this, or tight ones. And then as they grow, they form all these different shapes. So you end up getting these icosadodeca and repeating patterns of icosadodeca, charge clusters within the water, and they can grow to really complex, large molecules. So here's a dodecahedron in water molecules that essentially becomes like a jitterbug that can fold in and fold out and expand and contract, and it's this dynamic process that happens, and it forms these beautiful patterns. If you linked all the look at the underlying patterns behind water. Water really likes to stick to icosa shapes, and that's why the platonic solids, water like, how did the ancient Greeks know this? They weren't able to see into this. Somehow they related the icosahedron to water, and here when we look at water clusters and how they can possibly form together in the geometries that we know nowadays, they were right. The ancients always seem to be right. And even though science can come along and say, oh yeah, that's not right, science learns to change one funeral at a time, basically. So you get people in academia and that are just hard, fast, no, that's impossible, that doesn't work that way. And it takes time for people to come to the understanding, and through repeated trials and error that we learn these things. And this stuff was all just wackadoodle stuff when I first got into it. People were like, yeah, you're crazy, the water has nothing to do with any of these geometry kind of things and that. And I don't know, there was a very few people that understood these things on this level. So they become these beautiful little patterns, and then they form superclusters where they can make more complex geometries. And so if you had something dissolved in the water, like sodium chloride, and this was like sodium chloride ions, and then they form more complex shapes. The more salt you added to the water, the more this pattern would start to appear, until you inundated the water where it wouldn't absorb the salt enough and it just looked like a salt crystal again. All these pictures came, and Professor Martin Chapman was here at the London South Bank University, did all this work years ago, and amazing to make all those pictures and geometries and that. So back in the early days when I was studying water, I dove heavily into his work, and it wasn't until a few years back now, I'm not sure, when did we, remember I ordered this book and when it came out and it came to your place. Yeah. There's a new fellow on the scene, Dr. Gerald Pollack, and he wrote this book, Force Phase of Water. So there was all kinds of questions that everybody had back then. It's like there was a lot of unanswered mysteries, and there still is today, about water. But we are slowly putting it together, and Gerald Pollack has written this amazing book, The Fourth Phase of Water, and he ended up answering a lot of those questions in here. And so you can really see how he studied basically what he called easy water, or the exclusion zone is what EZ stands for. And anytime water comes into contact with a surface, it forms these layers of geometry where things stick to the walls and form these plates that are similar to graphene. So it can form geometric plates, and you can increase surface tension. So what surface tension is on top of water, when you see the meniscus where the why do bugs land on the water and they can zip around like a water beetle, and bugs and things like that on top of the water. They were running on the surface tension. And what that is special two-dimensional geometries of water that's connected together. And that's where he wrote this book and answered a lot of amazing questions and put a lot of things together.
You can go to YouTube and type in the fourth phase of water, and Pollack has done some lectures on YouTube, and I think even a TED talk. And so for further research, definitely worth checking out the fourth phase. That's where the secrets are. Yeah,
and he's also wrote another book on muscles and proteins and stuff like that gets further down the rabbit hole. It's really crazy. So amazing stuff, water. And so one of the things that we're starting to experiment with now, we're building this farm, and it's an experimental farm, and primarily we're growing fungi. It's more, I call it a biological manufacturing facility, because we are using all kinds of really neat tricks with water and things, and electricity and things like that, to create basically food, medicine, and energy. Because if you go back to this thing here, if you were able to line water molecules like this, basically the next layer that sits on here, this here water molecule will float right in the center here. So you have this, it's almost like graphene. So everybody's familiar with graphene. It's like a single sheet of carbon that can combine in these hexagonal sheets. And you can create a battery that would just be made up of water. If you were able to align enough of these sheets together, basically you could create poles of a battery, so we could be getting energy from water in sort of a crystalline storage mechanism. So we're experimenting with things like this, and one of the things we're working with is electroculture. And much to my surprise, I've had this electroculture. How many people have heard of electroculture? All right. One. Okay, good. Well, I'll be darned, because, you know, I looked into all this stuff in the early days. Remember I was saying about the medical devices, and in the early medical textbooks there was all this medical instruments that used electricity for doing basically treatments of various conditions. Well, in the early days, in the early 1900s, one of the things people did with electricity is they grew plants with it. And they made all kinds of different gardens and things like this with antennas that could basically receive a sort of static charge from the air that's made up of all the different cosmic elements and rays that is being beamed into the earth, as well as the electrostatic fields in the air. And they put up antennas in their garden, and their plants grew better. And so it was a big thing. And it was published in books like Everyday Engineering. 1917, yes. So going from the late 1800s, now realize the connection to this. This is the same time that these guys were building these electromedical instruments. It was just, you know, the way everything's been going. And when you see some of the pictures of people and the crops they grew, you'd be amazed at what can happen in the garden with this. But basically what you did was, and this is real simple, you can all do it at home. Oh, and so here's the crazy thing, the story I was going to tell about this, is that I told Wyatt Wood about a year and a half ago, I was like, yeah, when we, you know, move forward with this farm, we'll do all kinds of cool experiments, and we'll build fields out in the end, in the field, and we'll put gardens in, and we're going to experiment with this electroculture. And nobody knows about it, and it'll be a really cool experiment, and supposedly you can grow these plants really huge and do all this stuff. And so a year and a half later, and I just on a whim, I just typed in electroculture into the internet to see if there was any new data, because there was nothing. There was nothing before. Like even 10, 15 years ago, there was not a lot. You found all these old books and all these old drawings and pictures like this, and you've seen all these people doing crazy things. Well, much to my surprise, all of a sudden, 100 YouTube videos pop up, and here's all these like soccer moms and stuff doing, I'm doing electroculture. And so it's a big fad now. If you Google it, you'll see all kinds of people doing it, which is really cool. I'm like, okay, wow.
So what's he doing there? I can
So,
see what he's doing.
yes.
He electrifying the water.
Right, yeah, what he's doing here, he's taking electricity that's on this electrode, and he's standing, see, he's not connected to the ground. So this is an isolating thing. So he's standing on a table, so he isn't touching the ground himself. So he's running a charge through the steel chain, basically, to the hose of water and charging the water. So in this case, he's just charging the water. As we saw in all the previous water molecules, how they get real aligned like that, increasing that quality of the water to change that bond angle to be more in line with the 108 degrees to provide the best water that the plants could possibly imagine. And he's watering the trees. Now, what's happening? The trees are taking up more minerals from the soil, they're breathing more, the respiration's more, photosynthesis increase, and they basically just grow bigger, better, stronger, more nutrient dense, and it's incredible the things they were doing back then. Here they got a trolley system where he rides along with his electrical line, and waters the fields. And
What circle is
this
this?
is well, it started. This is early, late 1800s. Yeah, and then early 1900s they got a little more advanced, but it kind of faded in and out through history too. The French were onto it. The Britain was onto it. Between World War I and World War II, after the First World War, this was a thing, right? And they were like, holy smokes, we're going to have to feed all these people. And they had huge experiments. For 20 years, they experimented with this and kept all the records of it secret. So there's been a lot of, it's another one of those suppressed things that's happening in history. So even right here, there's some records have come up where it shows that they did all kinds of experiments with it in the early days. Then the other simpler methods that everybody can do at home if you don't want to risk electrocuting yourself, like that guy, if he stepped off of that table, he would just be like, simpler methods is you just simply plant metal sticks in your ground, in the ground next to your roots, or you can put zinc plate at one end of your garden and a copper plate at the other, which makes like a natural battery, and connect a wire in between the two, or an insulated pole with an antenna up on top, and you can make all kinds of different antenna patterns, and then you run a wire down and you plug it into the ground, basically into your roots. And you can do it as simply as taking a stick and wrapping a copper wire around it and plugging into your plant pots or in your garden. So one of the fellows was a professor, Carl Lindstrom. He was a geophysicist, and he was studying, you might have seen other talks that I've had about Christian Birkeland, again, another geophysicist person who was studying the northern lights. Because the northern lights are plasma, and it's energy coming in from the sun, billions and billions and gigawatts of power dumping into the earth that lights up the sky like a giant Therify bulb. And when you think about the earth, well, that's what it is. The northern and the southern hemispheres have the poles, and that's where the Van Allen belt extends from the earth, that is like our little force field that protects us from the sun. So it hits that Van Allen belt and it has to go up into the poles to charge it. And the energy, there's bazillions of watts of power coming in from the thing. So he was studying this up in the northern lights, and he thought, well, geez, all these northern boreal forests live in such a harsh climate. They have such a short summer, and it's very cold and very wet. How do these things have very quick growth in the amount of times they can? And he thought, his hypothesis was that the energy coming in on the North Poles was fueling those plants and making them grow better. So he started looking into this electroculture, and he wrote this book, Electricity and Horticulture, after a few years of studies. And basically when you go back and you look at how they're making some of these antennas, well, just look at trees, look at pine trees and the northern conifers and that. They're all antennas. They're all fractal. They're fractal antennas that are basically sticking up out of the ground. Just look, it's right before your very eyes. They're just pulling in the charge for the thing. And how does a tree stand by itself anyway? Have you ever seen trees coming out of a cliff, and the roots are just like barely hanging on these little rocks, but yet this tree is practically, thousands and thousands of pounds being suspended in the air? Perhaps it's got something to do with their fractal antenna charge and the energy they're pulling in to be able to maintain that balance.
We had a project in Australia called the Aura Tower.
Okay, no.
Can you talk about that?
No.
And it was with one of Australia's top physicists, a guy called Prioré.
Yeah.
So, cut a long story short, you can read about it actually on Breakthru-Technologies. Just go to the Aura Towers. So Prioré, he worked out, okay, plants receive millions of frequencies from the sun, just like we do, but he actually worked out that they only use 64. Right? It's interesting, 64 hexagrams of these.
64 of frequencies?
Yeah,
okay.
frequencies.
Yeah.
So, and then he designed what I ended up branding Aura Towers. So they were sort of like little towers, and and we connected up with the frequencies, and he accelerated the growth of a cactus.
Oh yeah.
So you know how so he had one without the aura tower and one with the tower, and this one's like growing really, really fast.
Yes. And you can do that with the electroculture. It's the same. There's lots of people on YouTube doing these videos and stuff like that, where they'll just put 2 flower beds or 2 flower pots, one right beside each other, one with an antenna in it, and you can literally see the difference in the growth.
Does it deplete the soil more underneath?
Well,
That's the right
it's going into the fruit though, or the vegetation, and that's what you're eating. So that's what you want.
Yes.
You want to
At the end
deplete
of the
this.
day,
Next growing season,
Yes.
you have now drain the...
This would be done with proper horticulture.
Yeah.
You'd be doing that, but you'll be rejuvenating the soil at the same time. Besides, you're putting more microbes into the soil with that electricity anyway.
Yeah.
But yes, you'd still have to be doing the
Is-
compost and rejuvenating the soil. But that's,
Yeah. In a
that's
model.
the right question.
And if the compost is from the plants that have...
Yes.
Well, that
Yeah,
compost
absolutely.
will work- the compost will break down faster as well.
Yeah.
because of the
Yeah.
electricity.
So has that been tried, putting a antenna in the compost to help it break down quicker?
Not yet, but
Not
that's
yet.
that's in the
your
works.
project.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's where we.
Tadpoles, I'm away.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, 100% to stimulate that. And I mean, the thing about depletion of the soils, like, soil never traditionally got depleted. Soil grows. The earth is a living crystal. And I don't know if anyone's heard of the expanding earth theory. I kind of subscribe to this idea that if you look at the idea of Pangaea and that all the continents were all linked together at one time and they slowly broke apart to become, South America and Africa and all this. Well, it doesn't make a lot of sense that they were all just on one side of the earth and the whole earth was water. Because wouldn't that just like wobble and would really be putting us in a wacky sort of spin? If you look at take on a Google Maps and you start looking around in the water, you see a lot of really interesting anomalies, and a lot of them they've scrubbed out, that you don't want to see any underwater civilizations or things like that that are buried under the water. But the plates, there's a lot of places, like with the story of Atlantis and things like that, civilizations have come and gone from this planet for millennia, and the whole idea that we are of a limited idea of our history, that we're only 6,000 years old. It started with the Bible, when everybody were like, oh, we can add up all the lives of all the people going back to Adam, and the earth is only 6,000 years old or whatever. But why have we had these ancient civilizations and ancient stone circles and everything that's around here, all around us? And especially the ancient builder races that were making stone structures that we can't even do today. I mean, the pyramids are just one example. But if you look at places like old temples, and you look at the foundation stones and how a lot of them, at one time, there was ancient builder races that were able to mold the stones like putty. And you look around Peru, and Sacsayhuaman, Jordan, and all this. The foundations of those temples looked like those stones were molded into place, like they took plasticine and just took the stones and put them in there. Then those temples rose and fall and destroyed, and just the foundation stones were left. Then someone else came along afterwards, another ancient civilization, that was a master of stonecraft, and they created these fine-cut, laser precision, precise stones that built on top of those rounded stones. And so you can see all those layers in South America and places like Jordan and Egypt and that. And then you see which looks like machining and all those fine stones. But we've come and gone. The point is that we've had civilizations rise on this planet and then completely go. So there's been a lot of tumultuous things on this planet. So going back to the expanding Earth theory, is the idea is, instead of Pangaea being all the continents on one side of the planet and the rest was all water, it's just that the Earth was a lot smaller of a sphere a long time ago. And as I talk about all that energy coming in from the sun, not only is that electricity and charge coming in, but elements, because the sun is a nuclear furnace, right? All the elements are being made. Well, there's tons of things coming into the Earth, and the Earth is growing slowly, slowly, slowly. And water, as we move around the sun and our solar system whips through the universe, we're passing through clouds of water. Do you remember in the days where it was like, there's no life elsewhere, anywhere in the entire universe except for Earth? And there's no water out there either. There's absolutely no water. There's no water anywhere. But now we're realizing the universe is a lot of water. There's massive, massive amounts of water. It's everywhere. And without water, the reason why they said that is because they said, oh, there's no life elsewhere. We're the only living beings in the entire universe because you need water, and there is no water anywhere else. But no, there's tons of water. So what's happening is water is continuously coming, as well as all these other elements, into the planet. And leaving too. When you look at the trail that we're leaving as we're moving through space on that Van Allen belt, we leave this little tail, just like a comet's tail. And so elements are continuously moving into this planet and leaving. So the idea is that the Earth was just much smaller, and it's growing and growing and growing, and then that's what created all these continental drifts, and they moved apart. And when you look at the Google Maps and you go into the center of the ocean, you'll see these folds that we say, the fault lines and everything like that are continuously moving. Well, that's where the earliest growth in the oldest, or the newest land on the planet is, and the oldest growth is up in like the northern areas and the Canadian Shield, where the rock is like, millions and billions and millions and millions of years old. And the newest is in these, where the expanding all along the lines of all the planet, all the continents. So the Earth is a living crystal that's just slowly growing, 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 growing. So then if you think about plants themselves, like I was saying with the trees and everything being fractal antennas, look at a field of wheat and, look how they're creating their antennas. So my hypothesis is if we create, then this is what we're going to be experimenting with, if we create antennas in the shapes of these type of plants, we naturally pull in these types of energies that are in tune with the plants. And I want to be able to tune my antennas to the plants as well as to the nutrients, as well as to, let's say we want to customize the phytochemistry of the plants, because when you pick mushrooms in the wild, mushrooms, plants, and it depends on where the plants grow and how well they are. When we do a monoculture crop, like you're talking the depletion of those minerals in the soil, we're just, growing a single field of wheat. And it's just, one big, massive acres and acres and acres of wheat. And when you do that, there's no symbiotic relationship with anything. Then we spray fungicides, pesticides, herbicides, suicides, just everything onto these fields to kill off everything but what we want to grow. And therefore the soil just blows away and we deplete the soil, we deplete the minerals and so on. So why not build these antennas to increase all these kind of things. So you can go back and read a lot of the history, it's fun, and to my amazement, all kinds of people are doing it today. It's absolutely incredible. So here's one antenna. A lot of people are doing these sort of spiral guys, a lot of spiral shapes. You can do it as simple as this. You can just go get some copper wire, and you can re-salvage old copper wire from wherever you're ripping out electrical things, or you can buy raw copper wire and wrap it around sticks, stick it in plant pots, and play with it. Yeah. So what they were doing in the early days was, and who else? Who else did this? Was the fellow that came up with the multi-wave oscillator. He would take Lakowski. Yeah. He would take spiral rings and put them around the plant. So basically picture your plant in the middle of that spiral and spiral it around, or even just a single loop spiral. So you leave an opening and you just take a copper ring, fold it in a circle, pull it apart, and put it around your plant. And that works as well. And he showed quite a few experiments with it. The other,
Five spirals on that.
yeah, Yeah, and there you go. Wind and phi ratio. I mean, you can just, the sky's the limit with this stuff. You can just get really creative and really create really nice gardens.
Yeah.
People are taking crystals and they're winding crystals inside of these coils and putting them at the top. So all you basically need to do is have one end in the ground and the other end up in the air. And the sky's the limit with this. The other side to this was magnetoculture, and you can use magnetic fields to influence growth. Oh, and by the way, China is on to this. Even the World Economic Forum published a paper on this electroculture and how this could be the future of feeding all these people. But China has got massive amounts of 10,000 acres or some crazy thing that they're running with electricity. I'm just going to wrap it up with the magnetoculture. Yeah, sure.
There's
Yeah.
a lot of people using it to keep chemtrails and their chemicals
Right.
from falling on the ground.
Yes. And
Because you're connecting the earth to
Yeah.
the sky, and the plasma, or whatever you want to call it,
yeah,
is keeping chemtrails. So
yeah.
it's a
This
lot of nice funky stuff if you go on Facebook.
absolutely. And this goes back to Wilhelm Reich, who I talked about at the beginning. That's what he was doing, and he was doing exactly this. He was taking copper and aluminum wires in a spiral like this, and he'd make these, he called cloud busters. And they were basically just, literally looked like cannons or like some kind of machine gun kind of thing, where it had all these barrels, which were just pipes that he'd point up at the sky, and he'd take spiral wires coming off of these pipes, and he'd throw them in a stream or onto some ley lines where there was a high energy spot, natural occurring vortexes, and you point these things at the sky, and literally you'll make a hole in the clouds and open it up and bring the sun. And on depending on your settings and different ways you operate these things and where your grounding antennas are put, you can also make clouds and make it rain. So the other side to this is magnets. So electricity and magnetism go together hand in hand, and magnetic fields also, you can use just magnets to treat seeds to increase germination rate. You can use the magnets in the soils around the plants with little wires wrapped around them too. And there's been several papers that have come out recently on increasing, the nitrogen, the phosphorus in the soil. So to answer your question, you can use the magnetic fields to increase those minerals in the soils and the plant uptake on them. And yeah, there's quite a few. And China especially doing all this stuff. And basically that's what we're going to be doing. And I'll maybe talk about this on our next talk, on the mushroom talk, because that's what we're doing at 5 Factor Farms. So yeah, exciting stuff. And what this really has to do with is water. It comes back down to water, how those antennas are working in the soil. They're influencing the matrix of the water and improving the bond angles on the water and the microclusters, and they're holding the elements more, taking out the elemental ions from those minerals into a nice charge cluster that the plant goes, oh, you're perfect for me, I need you to do all these things, and absorbs it, and the plants just go crazy. Yeah.
So can we sleep with some copper around a piece of wood in bed with us?
Yes, and be careful. So there's all kinds of these YouTube people out there. The grounding thing, it became a big thing for a while. The best grounding is walking bare feet across the grass on your yard, on the dewy grass in the morning. Incredible. So people got this wise idea that, well, let's just ground. And all these grounding mattresses and grounding things and grounding plates when you're sitting at your desk and stuff came out. And these people, in just not knowing, there's a lot of them, and you look at this grounding and a lot of people are doing it. The mistake they're making, so what you really want to do it properly, is take your grounded bed sheets or put a plate underneath your bed, and they're making sheets with silver threads in them, and they have a little button snap where you can attach a wire to. What you really want to do is do exactly what you said. That should run out your window and go down the side of your house, the farthest away from your electrical panel and your meter, and go into the ground. And you'll get the best benefits from it ever. the mistake these people are all making is they're plugging it into that ground right there. And when you trace these two wires back, and we talk about EMFs and electrosmog and the damage of EMFs and all those things in other classes, it's huge. What this does, it's got a positive and a neutral that goes back to your panel, and the neutral on the line is bonded to the ground on the panel. And that ground has the same thing. You look closely outside your house, it runs out of your power, where your power meter is, out of your panel, that wire goes down, and it goes to a ground plate in the ground. So basically what we do when we use this electricity is we continue the loop. You know how you have only one wire sometimes that comes to your house, and that goes to a transformer, and then it goes to your panel, and then it operates your computer, and then where does it go? There's no other wire to go back. We tie it to the ground, and we dump all that electricity into the ground. It's a very bad thing for the earth, and a very bad thing for you if you take your bed and plug it into that thing, because you're just dumping all that RF into you too. So yes, grounding is great and it's incredible, but be careful, and please don't do that. That's the biggest mistake that people are making with that. You'll see tons of people doing that. But if you're doing that, you basically turn yourself into an antenna that connects all that dumping energy to you.
So
Yeah.
do some, you're finished.
Yeah, questions? Yeah.
Do some questions. Like, I think one of the questions that I often get asked, just some fundamental things about water. How can you structure water at home?
Right.
So
Okay, so we
let's do
covered
that.
them.
Or
Yeah, magnets.
Let's cover the basics.
Yeah.
Do you want to do it on the next talk? Or?
Nope, yeah, we can cover it
That's
real
a good
quickly.
question for now.
Yeah. So the best and easiest is vortexing, right? Your water's got to spin. When you spin it in anything, you can't just let it sit. So when we charge water in a Therify, all we do is take, because you're in that electrostatic field. So there's the electrical charge, there's the magnetic charge, there's the minerals that all have their natural charges on them as well, and there's magnets. So if you're going to use magnets, you can experiment with the polarities of the magnets around your water. The key is the spin. So it's got to spin, spin, spin. When we charge water in the Therify, we take a glass or a plastic, not metal, container and a wooden spoon, not metal or glass or something like that. And we just put it right in between the two tubes in the counter space, and we just spin it up and wait for the spin to finish, and there you go. Clustered charged water, because that's absorbed all that energy, imprinted in there, and made all new microclusters like that. The other one is rocks and minerals and things like that, like it does in the stream, having special vessels, special shape vessels. Water likes certain shapes. Water doesn't not like to turn 90-degree turns. It always turns in a spiral. Everything must move in a spiral. You can't just abruptly. So you think of all the plumbing under your house. And the other thing you think about is how that plumbing runs down your front street and connects to all your neighbor's place. And every time you turn on the tap, you're directly connected to your drunken neighbors who are fighting next door, and how that influences that water as it comes and connects to your place too. So you want to erase off that memory imprint. So you can erase it with UV light, which will erase it, but then the water is kind of dead. Then you just got to rebuild it back up. The best way and easiest way is really good minerals, really good sea salt, Himalayan sea salt, these kind of things. Get a good vortex going, drop some salts in there. So you can do magnetic fields, and if you really want to get crazy, you can do pulsed electromagnetic fields with electricity and use coils and do spinning vortexes, do some nice phi ratio coils, and imprint that way.
Are you talking about like a glass of water?
Yeah, you could do it in just a glass of water, simply. Yeah, stir it up. When you put metal in the water, use glass. It's a dielectric. It's a good insulator. Use a plastic spoon or something like that that's not going to steal the charge. As soon as you put the metal with the water, it'll pull the charge out into the metal into your hand. So use another glass rod if you don't want to use plastics, or a wooden spoon or something like that. And then drop in your things. The other thing is crystals. Like real crystals or minerals you can have around your water. And the other thing is pipes are usually just straight. Water doesn't just like to flow in straight lines. Look at any stream in nature, and what's it do? It winds like this. Because when it winds one way around the bend in a stream, it vortexes. and then it gets to the center, it reaches the still spot, the counter space, the 0 point, then it reverses directions and it winds. That's why rivers go like this. So when we come along and say, well, we want to put houses here, so we're just going to make this irrigation canal, and we make water flow in a straight line. By the time the water's flown a couple meters down a straight line, it's dead. It's not working anymore. It always has to move. So whenever you use your things, if you are using pipe, the best way to do it is make your pipes move in that. So you can get creative and you can make your pipes go in a 5 ratio down to like that, or in vortices or anything like that. So it's not hard. Oh, the other thing that I'll say about clustered water and things like that, like it was a big thing back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I suppose, when there's all kinds of waters on the market that were charged. I think it's got a renewal probably, eh? Is that what's going on? This charged clustered water? But there's all kinds of waters that were coming. So once you put it in a water bottle, and then you put it on the shelf, or that bottle sits on the store counter or whatever, it gets exposed to UV light and fluorescent lights and all that, you're wiping out those imprints. They're going away. So.
So I have one of your water spiralizing thing that's like a kit that spills, but
Okay.
so my water is toxic, so I have to filter everything.
Right, yeah.
When it goes through there and it's spiralized and energized, etc., and then
Yeah.
I put it through my Epic filter, am I changing it, or it's still going to be?
What kind of filter is it going through?
It's called an Epic filter.
Okay, I don't know that one.
Water supposedly takes all the horrible toxins that are coming from the army base.
Okay,
out
yeah,
of my water,
yeah.
and then I put minerals back in.
Okay.
Is that okay to spiralize it?
Yeah, spin before your filter? I would spin after the filter. I would filter first, then spin, then add minerals too.
Okay, that
Yeah, yeah. Well, the sequence is important too. So if you're going to use a UV filter in your house, don't put it at the end of the line, because if you just spun it and did all your magic stuff, then you just erased and you cleared all your charge with the UV light. Have the UV first. So ideally in a water system for your house, you want UV. Now this depends, because you want my sedimentary filter, charcoal filter. I guess the ultimate system would be sedimentary filter, charcoal filter, UV, because carbon and charcoal, again, is erasing. Sedimentary is pulling out all your bigger things. Then UV, which clears the charge and makes the other clusters and the other memories and imprints go away. Then the kind of filter you have, something like that, that's a energizing filter. Then magnetic spin. Yeah. Yeah.
Does it matter if you're doing clockwise or counterclockwise?
Ah, okay. So traditionally in Hermetic things, or in Celtic ideas and Wicca and that, you move clockwise directions will imprint things and bring things in, will invoke energies, and counterclockwise will expel them or banish or disperse energies.
Centripetal, centrifugal.
Yeah, and that's why we use both, because ultimately if you can work it into your system where you spin up and spin down, and then you can flip the polarity depending on what you want to do. Do you want to get rid of everything that's in your water, or do you want to bring everything in? So you could do vortexing in both directions too. Yeah. So often that's what I do when I spin up water on the Therify. I'll go clockwise, and then I'll go counterclockwise and do reverse. Or if you want to clear that water, if that water is a little bit questionable, do reverse. That'll pull all the energies that water has absorbed, and then go clockwise, and you'll pull all the energies that you're trying to imprint into.
For biodynamics people, when they stir the
Yeah.
treatment,
Yeah.
yes, but they're doing it alternately.
Yeah.
But that's to get the
Yeah.
spin in the...
Yeah. In both directions.
Point, I think, to get
Yeah. It's doing both things. It's both clearing and imprinting.
Does it say not to
Oh.
stir it with metal, but is wood okay?
Yeah, wood's fine.
Wood, glass.
Yeah.
Best not to use metal because of
Yeah.
fracturized.
In glasses, you know,
Disperses the-
really, if you're not worried about the chemicals from the plastic, plastic is better than glass even. The glass is such a when we looked at those shapes, like Gerald Pollack took, water against glass, you know how glass is it's really hydrophobic, like the water almost floats on it, like it'll bead up like that. The plastic, it'll move out a little bit more. So that we call those things dielectrics, and they change the aspects of it too. But in some cases, plastic can come in handy, and the glass for different purposes and different things.
How about ceramic?
Yeah, ceramic would be the best. So your very best vessel is natural ceramic or clay, right? And glazes on clays if they're not loaded with toxic metals or things like that. Yeah, ceramic eggs are probably your best vessel to have. Even those clay pots and those clay water dispensers or ceramic water dispensers and those are all really good. Yeah.
Does the temperature make any difference?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So the colder it is, the slower those molecules are going to move. The hotter it is, the quicker they're going to move. So if it's too hot, you can stir it all you want. They're not going to hold in place. Water's ideal temperature is at 4 degrees. This is what Victor Schauberger said. So when you measure a stream or a natural spring, the water comes out of the ground at 4 degrees. When you cut all the trees away and the water gets exposed to too much light and things start to die off, it's because you're raising the temperature too much. It's one of the big problems we have is the temperatures in our streams are getting raised up too much, and then the fish are dying and things like that. So the best temperature to do any of these processes at, if you want to control temperature, is 4 degrees. Yeah. Yeah.
Paul,
Yes?
sorry, how does water hold memory?
In these, just like crystals, in these patterns. So just like your hard drive, and it was Marcel Vogel that invented so many crystal things. Is anybody familiar with Marcel Vogel? Probably the Vogel crystals, right, are famous. Marcel invented all kinds of things, fluorescent colors, like in the 60s, all those fluorescent psychedelic posters. He created that paint from fireflies that he was interested in when he was a kid to study that. He created the liquid crystal displays that came out on the early calculators and your watches of liquid crystals. He created the crystal hard drive platter and the original hard drives for IBM. So that crystalline matrix is what stores the data, just like a hard drive stores the data, same kind of thing. So the bigger your charge clusters like that, and the most important thing is that water is remembering whatever its environment is, just like astrologically, when you're born, you're imprinted with the influence of the cosmos and all the planets into you as you're a liquid crystal being solidified at that time, and that's why your astrological chart is fixed. Same thing. So whatever your environment is, that's where you're putting the information into that water. Yeah. Yeah. It's a great... it's one of my favorite things, water. And it's infinite. It just keeps going. The further you go down the rabbit hole, the better it gets.
So you said that we're living on Earth is a living crystal,
Yeah.
and so crystals are living,
Yes.
we would say.
Yeah.
But the crystals that we see and we use are very thin. They're hard.
Right.
They're solid.
Yeah. But they're
if
still
we zoom out
still living.
from the Earth.
Yeah. Because they grew in the earth, right?
Right, but like we have like the surface of Earth is that there's like a layer outside of the solid Earth.
Yeah.
So what is that like on the crystal? On like the zooming in and
Right.
zooming out, like what is
Yeah.
the difference? If the Earth, that's cool, like Earth is a crystal.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
how is that?
Yeah.
How is it the same as like a crystal that we see in our hand?
Yeah, so a crystal in your hand, it's living and it's conscious as well, and this is what the alchemists would say, is that it has a consciousness. But crystals took long time, millions of years to grow. So they have a lifespan. They're born, they live their life, and they die. But we're just a blink of the eye of that. So they have a really long lifespan. And then on the surface of them, it depends on their environment. So in the early stages of their life, they're born within the earth, just like the baby's in the womb at that point. And it relies on its environment and all the surrounding minerals that are, and a lot to do with the water and the charge in the earth. And then the perfect conditions, when you meet all the right conditions in the embryo of the earth, then the crystal is born. And it starts as a seed and it'll grow. Then when we dig it up and harvest it and pull it up onto the surface, it's just a blink of the eye for that crystal. Well, it rides with you in your lifetime and goes in your pocket and wherever you go. Yeah, you think the crystal's going to be around a lot longer after we go. And even if it gets broken and shatters into 100 pieces, well, all those little pieces, again, now they're seeds for new crystals. And they'll eventually go back into the earth and they'll become new again and they'll regrow from those old crystals. So what surrounds those crystals is the potential for life. And that's what surrounds all of us, because we are that. That's what we are. We're walking, living crystals. And the whole outer matrix of the earth is filled with this biological life that lives. So we're all like, just like cells in our bodies, we're all just cells to the earth. It's just fractal and recursive.
Because that's very much Pollard's theory too, isn't it?
Yeah.
The water in the body, you have to start to imagine
Keep
it
that
more like we're a liquid crystal.
Pristine, yeah.
So,
Yeah, and we have to do the same to the earth as we do our body. So, I mean, cosmic changes and all that. There's this whole thing about global warming. Let's take a good one. This isn't okay. Oh wait, we're almost out of time. All right. But what I'm just going to sum it up real quickly is that we're in a constant state of change and flux, and change always happens. And you have to be really mindful about what you do and how you treat everything and everybody around you. And the better you can do that and the better you can treat yourself, then the better the world is that we're going to be living in. Yeah.
So is there a correlation with the ancient people used to have these moats around buildings and these antennas, and they were very fragmented on the top because they were apparently antennas?
Yeah. Yeah, churches, buildings, all the steeples and spires and all that, they're again antennas and emulating crystals to channel in the energy, to put the energy in that place. That's why we build steeples and churches and cathedrals and things like that, because the building itself is a crystal. When we build, and think how crystals work, when you have those nice fractal crystals like we built in the old times, in the Gothic period where we had real elaborate spirals, and just look at other cultures in Asia and that where they put the corners of their buildings, they fold them back in on themselves so they don't have a point of charge that's bleeding, they're absorbing the energies, they're fractal capacitors for the people and the energies inside. When we build square cubic buildings, and live in square houses and that, we're losing charge, you're discharging, yeah.